me step back and kiss myself. 12 picks in a row, 9 parlays, Elves Brenner, a plus 525 underdog. One of the betting upsets of the year, almost 200U the last 2 fight nights, and over 200 units since UFC Charlotte. Oh man, oh man, oh man, not again, not again. Back-to-back clean sweeps. Am I not the hottest bettor in the world right now on International Goddamn Fight Week? Welcome to the MMA RAXPOD, degenerates, degeneritas, and degenerati. If it's your first time here, welcome to the party. You remember that call the Washington Wizards commentator had when Michael Jordan hit that game winner in his 40s?
Shoots.
You are goddamn right I did. And to all you bookie bastards out there, I'm going to keep kicking you in the fucking teeth and showing my work for free. In this moment, I am untouchable. So please follow on Twitter, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, and allow me to bask in the sun while it still shines. And thank you to all the loyal followers that have helped me soak in the joy of the success. It truly warms my heart to read and know that I have helped you more than you can understand. Another clean sheet merits another touch grass worthy rant, although I promise the only streaks I'll be referencing this week will be more betting oriented than of the Calvin Klein variety. Not talking about that sleepover that Tracy Cortez had with a certain secret juice merchant either. I will get to all of the picks in short order. They're all time-stamped if you want to skip this nonsense and just get to the analysis. But allow me to compare my victory lap to what another bettor did with their weekend in Miami, because this will shed some light not only on the current state of the combat sports gambling media influencer space, but also the future of the MMA RAX platform. Sunday morning, after netting 123 units, I woke up at 5 a.m. Eastern. I took a hot bath, and then I drove to the beach across the stretch of highway you see in the background. I watched the sunrise over the Atlantic, enjoyed some music, observed the clouds colliding as they rolled over the ocean, and finally put a bow on the perfect morning, following a perfect evening, quite literally, with yet another triumphant breakfast at the most recession-proof business in the United States, Waffle House. I tipped 50%, drove home, enjoyed an afternoon at the pool, and then started crunching the numbers for UFC 290 that same day. That is how I celebrated calling one of the betting upsets of the year on my way to a 12-pick winning streak that goes back to the prelims of UFC Jacksonville. While MMA RAX has already won the hearts and minds of many bettors and will continue to earn each, I would hardly call the brand a successful enough one yet to say it is truly influential in the digital conversation around the UFC. I hit 600 followers on Twitter this week and doubled the YouTube subscribers since the last RAXPOD, which reflects 20% audience growth over a little more than the last month and 50% across the last 3. The brand is blossoming, and I am more than grateful to that I can express to those of you that have discovered it early on. But erecting and elevating an online platform needs every ounce of clout it can get for reinforcement along the way, no matter how off the mark that word clout sounds. So in a moment when the brand is thriving to the tune of 9 parlay hits across 2 fight nights, and could receive a massive boost with only a moment of recognition from a bigger platform during a promo run for a pay-per-view card, it seems somewhat convenient that Ariel Helwani's Vox Media production, The MMA Hour, decided to completely ignore its weekly Parlay Pals segment ahead of UFC 290 during International Fight Week in Las Vegas. I didn't send them a ticket to put on the show last week, but they have left MMA RAX out of the segment on multiple previous occasions, although I had no grievance in any of those cases. People hit ridiculous winners on every card. I see people hit several specific prop parlays that I don't have access to with my book that go nuts every week and deserve showcasing on a scale like that. I knew I would have something undeniable to share with the world eventually myself. And I do this week. But with that in mind, you can imagine my frustration in listening to Connor Burks this week, also known as GC for some reason. But that's definitely not an abbreviation for good capper, because this guy was too embarrassed to recap his performance from UFC Vegas 76. Allow me to do it for you. Instead, Burke spent his time with 6,000 people watching the MMA Hour live stream, describing how while on vacation in Miami this past weekend, while I was watching the sunrise after a second straight clean sheet, a waiter at a beachside steakhouse talked him into ordering a gorgonzola-encrusted steak that went on to give him indigestion at his friend's grandparents' house. Riveting story, right? If you tailed the bets that the producer of the MMA Hour conveniently forgot to recap this week, you probably did not appreciate hearing how Burks did not want to pay another $70 for an umami-less ribeye instead of issuing an apology for deploying a unit on the Kevin Lee money line at an event he believed to be titled UFC Apex 76. According to the promotional graphics he created for his bets. That sort of attention to detail probably explains why Mr. Burks is down 26 units this year and is 4-9 on his last 13 straight bets and missed both legs of a juiced parlay last weekend that included Ismail Bonfim, who I said not to bet, stay away, and, of course, everyone's favorite minus 700 close, Guram Kutateladze. At least GC beat the line on Guram by 300 points. Last week's episode of the MMA Hour, ahead of Apex Fight Night, headlined by America's sweetheart, Sean Strickland, had roughly 140,000 views when the following episode streamed ahead of UFC 290. I mentioned how Burks is 4-9 on his last 13 straights. That's because he went 2-7 at UFC Jacksonville before stating, for what many paid chat subscribers claimed was the third or fourth time he's had to do so, that he needed to limit himself to just 5 bets per card going forward. So, instead of providing transparency on how his more conservative betting weekend resulted in yet another losing card, Burks utilized this time on a show with a live audience of well over 5,000 people to exchange details with Helwani about their weekend dinner experiences. And then Burks put out more plays for UFC 290, and Ariel did the DraftKings read afterwards, or beforehand. How does someone objectively bad at betting on fights, something Burks actually admitted himself a year ago on the MMA Hour during an episode when the show remembered to run the Parlay Pals segment on International Fight Week ahead of a pay-per-view, have such a platform to put out such bad advice? Should you really be trusting Burks any more than someone like Minty Bets, that recommends going in on an Arlovsky over at nearly 2-1 juiced odds? She at least had a better weekend than Burks between Fight Goes the Distance on Dawson Ismagulov and the Strickland money line, so tip my cap to you, Miss Minty. Any bookie partner is not your friend. Most of the advice in this space that isn't paywalled to death on a Substack or independent website is not there to help you make an informed decision. An affiliate deal helps a gambler privately hedge their losses by benefiting off the burden incurred by their link followers signing up for new accounts with books before tailing bad bets. Just imagine what it can do for an entire media outlet with a nationwide reach and an international audience. I am not declaring that anyone affiliated with the MMA Hour, Vox Media, or any major book saw my 6-leg parlay hit over the weekend and had Burks or Helwani mute the parlay pals for this week. But it is suspicious that they did not do so for International Fight Week last year, despite the longer parlay draft they did for the UFC 276 show. That they passed over doing the show on a Monday for only the second time in 2023 and felt the need to address the part of their audience upset with the surprise absence. The only other time they didn't do a show this year was when Memorial Day was actually on a Monday as opposed to the 4th of July being on a Tuesday. And Burks also elected to skip self-reporting a second bad week of losses while eagerly putting out new plays for UFC 290. Probably not a good look for the DraftKings sponsored show hosted by a BetMGM affiliate if the production's leading perspective on MMA gambling has to highlight a plus 7,194 6-leg parlay cashing with a plus 525 underdog attached after explaining away a weekend in which he lost 2.25 units. I have a talent for identifying patterns in behavior. The results of my work these past 2 weeks reflect that declaration. All I can do is call attention to an odd trend when I notice it. But I have the future of my own platform to worry about more than being potentially slighted by a guy that lets a fucking waiter talk him out of a ribeye and into ordering a slab of meat encased in burnt blue cheese. If I have any talents greater than the one I just referenced, one of them would be writing. And it would be an honor to share my perspective on the MMA world, betting on it successfully, and a variety of other overlapping topics in a written format that you and others can appreciate for free forever. But the road to that platform is long, and although I will chart the path fearlessly, the way forward is hardly clear. While commenting on the recent layoffs of his colleagues at ESPN, Stephen A. Smith went out of his way to defend Pat McAfee and his new deal with the worldwide leader, acknowledging his success in the sports content space. Smith said, "Pat McAfee is not an employee. He is a product that was acquired. I would know because I am an employee who is trying to become a product. That is the world we are living in." Smith went on to say he anticipates he could be next among the following cycle of layoffs, given the financial hardships Disney has incurred since Smith's lucrative contract extension prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Sports media is once again witnessing a major shift in its digital landscape. The most successful influencers have recognized that they must become their own brands in order to sustain long-term success, if not also consistent growth. Ariel Helwani recognized his own opportunity to pivot into this trend early on when the UFC unceremoniously released him in 2016. When Helwani ceased to serve as a UFC employee, he became a product that Vox Media eventually acquired in an inexclusive capacity. As one major sports media empire begins to feel the effects of prominent voices opting to invest in their own independence over the assistance of corporate comforts, so too will others in the industry. I know this because Vox Media wiped out most of its NBA coverage earlier this year in a purge of prominent team sites. And with it went about 80% of all the early sports writing I did while selling my soul to SB Nation. Forgive me for not offering a shoulder to cry on towards any bloody elbow babies that had a new site built for them on the backs of anonymous socialists from around the world. Dear listener, you and the other loyal combat sports fans are the lifeblood for the MMA RAX brand that seeks to always remain free. Every follower, subscriber, and ounce of engagement pushes this platform one glance higher towards the audience it wholeheartedly desires to address with a full website one day, including daily articles as well as more permanent resources to help educate new and existing bettors or fans in the MMA community. As I did at this time last year when my follower count had yet to achieve even a triple-digit milestone during the last International Fight Week when I picked Dricus du Plessis to beat Brad Tavares. More on Mr. Stillknox later. I can never ask you more than to read, share, and tell. Please follow on Twitter as well as new accounts on Instagram and Threads. Hit the subscribe button on YouTube and provide any engagement you can across these social media channels. If you can merely do this for me, I will remain dedicated to giving you one of the most unique and ultimately entertaining and rewarding perspectives on this rapidly rising sport. Or at least better gambling advice than what you have from the space's most visible players right now. The hottest bettor in MMA gambling that spent the last decade becoming a digital sports writing producer and content strategist is now building a free sports betting platform for you to enjoy. Please help me get it done, and I will never ask you for anything else. Lend me your ears and your eyes, and I will give you the world. Okay, that's enough flowery nonsense. Let's get down to the betting knowledge. If you want me to recap, UFC Vegas 76 real quick, I mean, based on what I talked about, everything was flawless. So I'm not going to, stupid my own, victory any more than I just did in that rant I just went on. So go back and just look at what I put on Twitter and you can see what my thoughts were, because pretty much all of them were correct. And so we move on to UFC 290. And we start the night with a no play. Oh, man. Kemwella Kirk and Esteban Ribovics. All right, I'll try to make this as quick as I can since I am doing a no pick here. The thing with Ribovics is the guy came in undefeated and lost his UFC debut. So that's never a good sign, and it's especially concerning for someone that was favored nearly in the 2-1 range at the start of the week. The line is understandably slimmed a bit, and I completely understand why, because Kemwella Kirk has more UFC experience. He seems like the more well-rounded striker, even though Ribovics is definitely going to have the one-punch lights-out advantage. And there's, concerning habits that I think Kirk has from a fight IQ perspective that might play into Ribovics being able to hurt him. Kirk's definitely got the advantage with the UFC experience. I'm just really concerned with the ring rust, which is one of the reasons I think Ribovics is favored here. And you go and watch the Amir Khani fight that Kirk had, which was supposed to be his most impressive performance, and it's the only fight that he's won in his MMA career by unanimous decision. He's got 2 losses by split. It just wasn't something that is conducive to inspiring betting success. You don't typically see fights where the guy landing damage from the bottom is rewarded unless it's performed on something like an up kick, which can change the course of a fight. Outside of that, elbows from the bottom may, do damage to the guy that is trying to operate out of top control, but you don't want to rely on a guy whose skill set is based on doing damage from the bottom. Not necessarily submission attempts, because some fighters that, use submissions for getting back to the fence. Dustin Poirier is a very good example to aid their get up. That's actually something Ribovics does very well with the Kimura. You will see, even though it's not typically something that is good when a fighter gives up their back, some fighters opt to do it because they have other technique involved in that decision that they feel comfortable using it to get back to their feet as opposed to having to give up mount. So what you will see Ribovics often do is give up mount on purpose and then immediately turn one way to his back. And while he's doing that turn, before the opponent can put him in a choke, he will grab the wrist control and go for the Kimura. And because he's just constantly fighting the hands, there's enough distraction going on that he's able to get back to his feet. Ribovics has more of that urgency to put the fight back up there. Kirk is a bit more of a guard goblin, and it's why he had to do that damage from his back, and I think it's why he hasn't really had a favorable performance going the distance, even though he's gotten 2 splits. And he's moving up a weight class into lightweight. So Ribovics needs to prove himself here. I think Ribovics should knock this guy out. I have Kirk graded to win, but it's on a very slim margin, and it's on the basis of the numbers indicating that he's going to be the better late round performer, only because Ribovics had never been to a decision in his last fight. It was his UFC debut, and he lost. So I would think you'd have to be more confident that Ribovics is going to be able to make adjustments to put a longer-term fight like that on his terms now that he's transparently seen what happens when he goes the distance, as opposed to a guy like Kirk who we've kind of seen who he is at the UFC level. So I have Kirk graded to win. I'm not confident that he's going to do it, but Ribovics is in an obvious front-running position given he's never won an MMA fight by decision relative to a guy like Kirk whose only MMA decision win was under bizarre circumstances against a guy who's no longer with the promotion. Although we wish the best to Makwan Amirkhani in his presumed resumed modeling career. Don't bet this. This is dog or pass, so go ahead, take Kirk if you want. But I'm not going to play it because there's better dogs on this spot. On this card, rather. Not in this next fight, though, which features Jesus Aguilar and Shannon Ross. I don't think this is going to be a great night for Australia and New Zealand, necessarily. So I would definitely, and I think it starts here. Mr. Ross, the thing that concerns me about him, where I feel like this is more of a fade on him, honestly, than an investment in Aguilar, is Ross did not fight for more than a year and a half, nearly 2 years. About 1.75 years between his Contender Series appearance and when he fought on UAE Warriors and won by decision. The fight before that, he got choked out by Steve Erceg, who's now in the UFC and looking to make noise at flyweight. So most of this guy's success happened in 2019 and earlier, and then there was a 2-year gap where he didn't compete, got knocked out by Vinicius Salvador on Contender Series, got called up to be, I believe, a fill-in against Clayton Rodriguez and got knocked out inside of a minute. I don't feel good. I feel like he's KO or bust at this point. He really doesn't try to do anything other than initiate the boxing. And he hits hard, but there's several fight IQ habits here that should have you concerned. And Aguilar, there's just more upside all around. You definitely have to be concerned watching his Contender Series fight as well as the Tyra appearance, and then you look at Aguilar's entire MMA career, and I believe all but one of his wins are by guillotine. And the guy is not afraid to jump guillotine at all. Although you have to feel like for a guy that, according to the UFC commentary team, has the smallest reach in the history of the UFC at 62.5 inches, that is a tremendously tight squeeze. It's not something that lends itself to a lot of striking success. But he because of how muscular he is, he just throws himself in every punch, and he'll throw in combinations of 4 at a time, even if he doesn't always necessarily land. So even though Ross should be winning on the feet, Aguilar, I think, is going to be able to provide enough resistance there where the only times we've seen Ross in the last 2 years, or since 2020 even, the end of 2020 rather, so 3 years, he's been chinned. I think I wouldn't play a KO prop here just because Aguilar's never had a knockout himself, even though it looks like he's throwing bombs. I would imagine he's going to dominate the ground exchanges if the fight gets there, which is why he's favored. It's just a matter of how is he going to get there. But if he gets one good hit in on Ross, who's been chinned inside of a minute this year and was knocked out in his previous appearance, you just wonder if this guy is really UFC level, and he's almost certainly going to be cut after this if he's not able to beat Aguilar. Aguilar was fearless against Tyra. I mean, he won the first 2.5 minutes of the fight just sitting in his survival technique, but he was able to get it on him because he just rushed in and went after him. So if he is able to jump guillotine after setting it up a bit better against a far more beatable opponent, I totally understand why Aguilar was closer out to 2-1 at the beginning of the week, and I wouldn't have played him at that range, I don't think. I probably would have thrown him in the moonshot, but I wouldn't have been as confident playing him. He's on a much better price now. I am going to be thinking about making him a leg. I think there's better spots on here that I'm not going to do it, but all of the upside here is with Aguilar. And I don't understand why anyone would be putting confidence into Shannon Ross, other than if you strictly just watched his tape and were thinking, oh, he's going to be able to cheese on the range. To his credit, he is normally the shorter opponent, so this is going to be a rare spot for him where he's going to be able to have a significant reach advantage and height advantage, and he'll also have a stance advantage. But he's 8 years older, and he's just taken on far more attrition than what Aguilar's had to deal with. And even though the power upside is also with him, the damage tolerance simply is not. It'll be interesting if this fight goes beyond 10 minutes because Ross has way more experience going the distance, but Aguilar has had a little bit more success. So if Aguilar is able to throw up several submission attempts and keep this fight on the ground, I think he will probably have the advantage. But if Ross is able to keep the fight standing and do more damage, he's probably going to take it, which is why I do think there is a little bit of risk here with Aguilar, but he's understandably favored. I see why the line has come down a little bit, but I think all the upside is on Aguilar here. I would not take Shannon Ross as an underdog. Next fight, Tatsuro Taira and Edgar Cairez. There's no value on a minus 900 price tag. You people that are trying to bet Bo Nickal at 2,500 are Looney Tunes. Now, one thing I like to do in these spots usually, and where I've in the past hedged off, is, the rounds picks. And that is what I'm doing here, just because I think there's a little bit of value based on the fact that neither of these guys have really had any knockout attrition. Being submitted's a bit different. It's, that can be clean, a clean finish, not really much damage taken at all by the fighter long term, depending on how it's officiated. So Kyrez has 2 losses by submission, which is scary against a guy like Taira, but the only guy that that Taira's been able to finish inside of the first half of a fight was Aguilar in the last fight, which I believe was a short notice appearance against a guy who Taira is immensely larger than and is able to completely outclass with his limbs, and did so in getting the triangle after mount, which is similar to something that he did against CJ Vergara in setting up that armbar, which is very impressive. I mean, he basically let Vergara get back to his feet and trapped him in a third round. I believe it was third round, late second round or third round finish. But either way, he got it done inside the distance. Taira's undeniably dangerous, and he's young. Young fighters are prone to making mistakes, but Taira is the guy. The thing that is going to concern me about taking the over in terms of the plus 1.5 on this, which is what I'm doing, and I'm doing it at plus odds because I think that's good value given the attrition. But also, I don't expect Taira to be able to finish this guy, Kyrez, in the first round, because I think Kyrez is going to be able to give him more striking resistance than what Taira's had to deal with previously. And with more of that resistance in the first round, we haven't really seen one punch lights out power from either of these guys. I feel good that they're not going to do enough damage to each other where one of them is going to be compromised enough on the ground that a first round mistake happens. I think Taira's going to get the better of Kyrez later in the fight because what he's proven he's done already so early in his career is go back after the first round and digest and strategize with his cornerman about what he needs to do. And then he's able to go in and get to his positions on the ground that he wants to set up the finishes that he recognizes he can get by submission. He's very, very strategically brilliant at 23 years old. That's why he's favored so heavily above all of these fill-ins. It's why it's kind of hard to get a matchup for him, but he should be fighting the best of the flyweights at this point. I give him to Tim Elliott, please. I'm going to keep suggesting flyweights that need to fight Tim Elliott. I want the gauntlet at Tim Elliott after that bullshit with Victor Altamirano. Anyway, Kyrez, I think, is going to survive the first round. Where I'm going to be kind of sweating this out a little bit is when Taira comes out of the corner and sees, okay, where can I get in on Kyrez and start setting up these finishes? So Kyrez has never been finished in less than 8 minutes. If that trend holds, then this bet cashes. It's going to be difficult against a guy who's probably the most difficult opponent he's had in his own career, but Taira is fighting a guy that is way bigger than most of the other flyweights he's had to face. So I think this is going to be a bit of a unique challenge that he has to approach himself. And they are doing Kyrez a favor because it's short notice. This is a catch weight at 130. And Kyrez, they said on Contender Series, his corner was saying this guy will fight at 148 on fight night, that he'll rehydrate up to 145. I'm not going to pretend to know how the science goes into it, but the guy is massive for the weight class. He is. And Taira has been a benefactor of that himself in his early run. So I think now that he's finally encountering someone that has that similar advantage that he's usually had, he's going to have to be a bit more creative in terms of what he does. If he gets a first round finish here again, I mean, he needs to be fighting someone ranked in the flyweight next. No excuses, no pullouts, whatever. So Taira should cruise, I think, in the second half of the fight. I think the first half there's going to be a bit more turbulence, which is why I think the plus 1.5 rounds at plus 105 is the right call. I put that pick in and then it went to a pick 'em, and it has since rebounded down to plus 105. So you can still get it at plus odds. It has fluctuated the line a little bit, so we'll see if it goes in any other directions. But as of this recording, it is back in the range that I originally picked it at the top of this week. So go get it. Next fight, Vitor Petrino and Marcin Prachnio. This is interesting because the line has come down significantly from where I picked Petrino at. Prachnio was at a huge underdog at the start of this week. Petrino was, I believe, 285 when I called him, and then swelled out to 300. And at 3-1 odds, I didn't feel as good about playing him, even though I've got him heavily graded to win here for a variety of reasons. But the line has since come down a bit, significantly, actually, from what I called him at. And he's now available at 225, which I think is an extremely nice price. Because he's undefeated. His last fight, he went the distance and got a 30-26, and people were critical of his cardio, but he was constantly wrestling and getting takedowns and getting into solid positions throughout the fight against Turkalj. And there were two significant factors in Turkalj making it out of that fight that I don't think people are considering in how impressive it is that Petrino got a 30-26. The first is, I mentioned earlier, an up kick changes the course of a fight. Turkalj got one on Petrino that got him right on the chin, and he fell into top guard, and Turkalj just didn't recognize it in time where he could have done something with it. So Petrino had to fight the last 10 minutes after getting up kicked clean. That's not something that is typical. And it's also something that when his coaches see that after he's experienced it, they're going to, I would have to imagine, coach him up on making sure that he doesn't walk into that again in the future. So I don't think that's going to be a recurring mistake that we see. Turkalj also got away with several blatant fence grabs that allowed him to recover to sitting up from dominant positions that Petrino had secured. So I don't think that Petrino's opponent is going to be shown a similar amount of obvious grace and be able to score damage from the bottom in the same way that Turkalj did in an anomalous. I don't know if that's anomalous. I have no idea if that's a word. We're winging it here, folks. But Petrino's going to be doing that in the first round too. And because he's 9 years younger, I think he's probably going to get away with it. He's young and he can throw caution to the wind, and he has obvious knockout power. Last fight was his first fight to go to decision. And I'll usually say a fighter's a front runner if they, if they haven't won a fight by decision in their MMA career. So I took the under on Petrino Turkalj, and it almost ended in the first round, but it ended up going the distance. Petrino still had a dominant enough performance despite some of the criticism he picked up that I don't understand any of the optimism around Prachnio as an underdog. I bet Prachnio against Lins, and it was partially on the it was mostly on the thinking that Lins wasn't going to grapple because he hadn't shown that in the UFC. And then Lins did a lot of the cage clinching that made me feel like he was going to beat Maxim Grishin because he was just going to make that fight ugly and then, just mitigate anything that someone who needed to keep the fight on the feet would be able to do to win. I think Petrino showed he can do plenty of that to Prachnio. Prachnio is a leg kick cheeser. I think landed over 60 of them against William Knight, and William Knight just didn't throw anything back, famously, in that fight, which is why Pragnio was able to get the win. But against Lins, it didn't pay off enough for him. And this is a guy who lost his first 3 UFC appearances and has suffered way more attrition than Petrino has. I cannot believe the line is narrowed this much. I completely understood why Petrino was out to the 300 range. Now that he's down to 225, this is a surefire for me. I'm so in on this. Give me Petrino all the way. I will make him a leg this week, and we'll see what else we can pair him with. But I'm extremely confident that if he's able to just blitz Pragnio and get inside the guard, there's not going to be a thing that Pragnio has for this guy. Petrino is fun, and I think he's going to... I think if we have, because I forget what weight class Simon and Mitchell are in. They're in bantamweight. So we've got a lightweight fight between a guy with a lot of ring rust and a front runner from Argentina. And then we've got a flyweight fight between a 5'4" guy and a 5'6" guy, and the guy that's the underdog is probably going to get cut if he loses. We've got Cameron Simon fighting as a minus 500 favorite over a late replacement. If the night needs some excitement to get going in the early prelims, heading into the prelims, I think that Petrino is going to be at a good spot to set it off. Now looking at it, the bout order has changed, so my apologies for doing the Tyra Kairos fight before Petrino Pragnio. But in any event, I think it's probably worth looking at Petrino ITD, Petrino round 1 KO even. That's plus 175. Petrino inside the distance is minus 160. That is a far more playable price than minus 225. I think you should absolutely scoop that up if you're able to parlay that, and you're not limited at your book. Oh, well. Moving on. Jimmy Crute, Alonzo Menifield. A rematch from UFC 284. If you don't watch tape, this is a pretty good reason to do it, this fight, because it's not often that you get an immediate rematch in MMA coming off of a full 15-minute result. At least when a title isn't on the line. Jimmy Crute, I believe many people in the last fight, or relative to the last fight rather, are forgetting that he had not competed for about 14 months, so over a year. Menifield had competed much more recently. He was actually one of my heroes last year because right before MMA RAX went public, I hit a beautiful parlay thanks to the work that he did to Askar Mazarov in the minus 250 range, which was a very obvious spot as he was sitting there in the crucifix position. And then he followed that up with a Misha Serkinov knockout that I played the minus 1.5 on at better value because I figured Serkinov was going to get chinned. He did that in October and then fought again in February. So he had a productive 2022 with 2 first-round knockouts and then carried great momentum into 284 and very nearly put Crute away. I think Crute definitely got some grace from the referee in terms of that fight being allowed to continue, but, he seemed pretty coherent down the stretch and in the post-fight interview and was eager to fight again to run it back, and was the better performer late in a fight where one of the questions was who's going to have the worst gas tank between two guys that don't really go the distance. It ended up being the guy who had historically shown he has the worst gas tank in Menifield, was not as equipped to go the distance as a guy like Crute, who had been on a lot of ring rust but hadn't necessarily proven it one way or the other. So I do think that if this fight gets weird again, Crute's going to have the advantage dragging it out. But you did also see that Menifield didn't really have the takedown defense equipped to deal with the offensive wrestling Crute has. And if Crute's able to use that to get in on a better submission now that he's not carrying the same ring rust that he was in February, you would have to imagine he's going to come into this fight looking a little bit sharper in the earlier stages than Menifield, and than he did in his previous appearance. So I understand the pick'em odds because this was a draw when they fought literally last time. But I do think the key factor in this fight is going to be the fact that Crute's not carrying the same layoff that he had last time. Both fighters have an equal layoff in this circumstance. And Menifield did have an advantage of less ring rust in their original fight, even though Crute had benefits such as fighting at home, which I believe, he had crowd influence, and I do think Goddard showed him some grace in not stopping the fight. So if he just has to make adjustments to not get hit by Menifield, which other fighters have, I don't see why Crute can't get it done. So I won't be surprised if Menifield gets the knockout, but I think Crute has 3 different paths to victory here. 2 of them on the ground. Well, I guess 3 of them on the ground if you include by decision, but obviously we want to see more of a result than in the hands of the judges. But give me Jimmy Crute here outright. I do think that he's going to at least win one of the first 2 rounds and then get the third if it does go the distance. Otherwise, you would have to think he's going to be better about locking in the submissions than he was when he hadn't fought in a year back in February. The next fight I will be picking is Niko Price and Robbie Lawler. Now, I did notice, because I'm hedging on rounds in this, because it would be irresponsible to bet someone like Niko Price at minus 260. But you can't, I took a 40-year-old as a YOLO underdog on a card earlier this year that was not a good betting performance for me. It might have been a good betting performance. I don't think it was overall. But I believe it was Ed Sherman was his name. Now this is bothering me. I'm going to have to do this before I move on. Forgive me. I apologize. But I will find my mistake. Ed Herman, not Ed Sherman. The name Sherman is not good in UFC circles these days. Hats off to you, Chase. Hope you get another spot against a wrestler soon. But Ed Herman retired at 42, and he was an underdog fighting a 37-year-old on 3 years of ring rust, I think, in Zach Cummings. And I was like, yeah, just give me the underdog spot in that fight. But I saw the 40-year-old come out there, and I was like, oh, he's just trying to survive. And that's going to be Lawler. People are saying, oh, he's had good resistance in the Barberena fight. That's because Barberena gave him the fight that he wanted. Barberena just kept throwing volume and left himself open defensively, and Lawler was able to capitalize on that in moments, but ultimately took way too much damage, which Barberena recognized that's going to pay off. I think Barberena threw something like 160 significant strikes at Lawler in the first round alone when they fought a year ago, and he lost by knockout, standing knockout. That guy was out on his feet at 40 years old after eating, 250 strikes probably from Barberena in 10 minutes. And that guy's going to go out now and fight a guy that has had every win in the UFC by finish, but his most recent one, in less than 10 minutes. Price is sloppy. But that kind of sloppiness is something that gets rewarded, I think, in the context of when you're fighting a technical brawler like Lawler, who is going to invite these, stand and bang exchanges. When the punches are able to loop in at weird angles, they're able to hit and crack in a way that does damage that adds up. So even though Price isn't going to be delivering the same volume at Lawler that Barberena did, I think Price is still going to very easily be able to hurt him because he's hurt guys that are way younger that have taken way less attrition than what Lawler has had. I did notice that, I took the minus 2.5 rounds earlier in the week, and then I noticed later in the week a certain YouTube capper that tracks his units in school supplies, although I'm not on Bet MMA Tips, so who am I to judge? However, this capper took the opposite direction and tried to sell the pick on the basis that Lawler has only been finished twice in 12 years, which is a cute way of saying Lawler's been finished twice in his last 5 fights if you include the Askren result, which wasn't going in a good direction for Lawler objectively, even though he hadn't outright submitted. But we didn't see Kevin Lee submit last week against Renat Fakhretdinov, and we saw how that went for him. Thank you, Mr. Renat. Drip Lord Renat, I should say. Lawler, if you look at the fight that he had with Neil Magny, Magny is a decision machine, and once Magny knew that he had the last 10 minutes locked up, he drugged that out without embarrassing Robbie. Lawler, because he elected to wrestle early on and try to mix it up, had absolutely nothing left in the gas tank, and that was like 3 years ago. Barberena gave Lawler exactly the fight that he wanted, and Lawler wasn't able to capitalize on it. Price, I think, will give him something similar, but given the way Price has succeeded in the UFC, I can't imagine that he's not going to be able to knock out this 41-year-old in a professed retirement fight in the same way that we saw Shogun Rua get finished by Ihor Potieria, which I also took the minus 2.5 on. I mean, the only instance I can really think of in which a 40-year-old was in a professed retirement spot, which Herman didn't admit to until after the fight, but he's like the only guy I can think of that, in terms of a 2.5, he still didn't make it the full distance. He got finished in the last minute. So he survived a minus 2.5, I guess technically. The plus 2.5 went there, but that's the only situation you can point to. And that was 2 sloppy light heavyweights. These are guys at welterweight, much more technically sophisticated class. Price is 8 years younger. He's got the awkward style that does the damage. That's not something that is good for a technical fight finder like Robbie Lawler. I think this is headlining the prelims because so many people want to see Lawler one more time, but it isn't on the main card because they don't want to see something tragic. The flip side is if Lawler does something crazy and chins Price, the minus 2.5 still probably hits. Because if Lawler gets a knockout, it's not going to be in the final 2.5 minutes of the fight. So the minus 2.5 here is it's now minus 165. It was minus 155 earlier in the week. I think I'm going to parlay that with Vitor Petrino. And we'll look around for some other, we'll consider the field as the weigh-ins take place. I've already noticed one line is completely exploded on the fight I'm going to talk about next. So -2.5. All the best to Robbie Lawler. I hope you pull it off, but Niko Price is probably going to put you out round one. First round KO, Niko Price is at +350, by the way. So if you're a cheeky prop player, that's probably one worth looking at. All right, on to the main card. Jalin Turner, Dan Hooker. So this is funny. I had Turner just barely graded into the playable range for this. And I was like, is it really going to be worth playing him at 250? Let me go run a little bit more tape and make sure I want to do this. And I'm so glad that I did it, because not only did I get to watch the Dan Hooker-Dustin Poirier fight again, which revealed several fight IQ tendencies I hadn't previously seen with Hooker that make me concerned about his matchup with Jalin Turner. But then also looking at, the Turner fight, it was, nice to see why he earned at least a split decision against Gamrot in a fight where, looking back at it objectively, I see why he was given a 30-27. So Hooker, the thing that I think is going to be the problem for him is everyone that is taking him as an underdog is doing it on the basis that he's going to be able to deploy wrestling and that he is a good wrestler. He is not a good wrestler. He's had to work on his wrestling and he's made improvements, but he hasn't been able to deploy them at a high level where it's illustrated effective success, or against competition that, like Jalin Turner, that is going to be able to provide resistance getting back to the feet. Because Turner just fought Gamrot, and Gamrot got several takedowns, but Turner was able to fight back to his feet every time, despite the fact that Gamrot had a size disadvantage in striking, but in the grappling department had a base that was very conducive to tying Turner up and keeping him down on the floor, which is how he was able to do most of his damage and win that fight. But Turner still was able to get up to his feet enough times against a world-class grappling guy that you have to think that Turner is going to be able to get up effectively if Hooker's ever able to get inside and get him down in this fight. Hooker's wrestling was one of the main reasons he lost the Poirier fight. It's very important to remember that Hooker was up probably 29-28 heading into the fourth round of that fight, and him not being able to keep Poirier on the ground allowed Poirier to win the fourth. And then the fifth round illustrated something that I think is important also relative to Jalin Turner's own submission ability. The big problem with Hooker and him allowing people back onto the feet after he hasn't been able to retain dominant position with his wrestling is that he'll try to sloppily get in a submission attempt like a choke, but then we'll end up bailing on it. Something else that he does very poorly, which I think cost him the fifth round of the Poirier fight, is that he'll inappropriately try to turn a back take into a backpack. And he'll try to put it in a way that doesn't end up working, and his opponent is able to reverse that and put the fight back in a position where they can, if not put it into their control, at least make things neutral and ambiguous for a bit. But an elite fighter like Poirier is going to be able to take advantage of those moments every time. So when fighters begin to stand up, he'll chase submission attempts that he hasn't had a submission win in the UFC, I don't think, since Mark Diakisi. And that was at the end of 2017. So he's had 4 fights go to decision since then. And his only other submission win in the UFC was against a guy from the Philippines who had a 6-3 MMA record and went 1-3 in the promotion and never fought again after losing to Hooker. So not a lot of submission success compared to Turner, who at last year's International Fight Week put out a city kickboxing teammate of Dan Hooker's in Brad Riddell inside of a minute, which, hey, I was on Turner for that one too. You can go back and check the work. So I'm riding with Turner here. I think Hooker is liable to get knocked out or submitted, but much more so knocked out, just given he loves to trade when he's able to get opponents in on the fence. I can understand why people like Hooker. He still thinks he's a title contender at this point, which I think is extremely unrealistic. And you wonder, how much that mentality is going to pay off relative to a guy like Turner, who's 5 years younger, carrying less attrition, and who has fought more recently against better competition and illustrated the improvements that you want to see going into a fight like this. I think play Turner inside the distance if you want. I think KO or submission are both very live for Turner, so I think taking a specific decision prop is risky. But Turner round one probably is going to have more value on that. And in fact, in looking at that is a plus 135 relative to Turner's KO or submission prop for the whole fight. KO's plus 155, submissions plus 200. So I think he's live for both of those. And most finishes, when they happen in the first round. So if Hooker's going to trade as he did against Arnold Allen and he did against Justin Poirier and has illustrated he's willing to do several times, he's going to get chinned by a guy with the skills and power that Turner has. So, and it also, I think, bears highlighting that outside of James Vick, most of the opponents that have been able to match Hooker's size advantage have had a lot more success against him than opponents that have been smaller. Yair Rodriguez comes to mind very early in his own career. So I think Hooker is someone who fights much better when he's got a size advantage that illustrates itself, and he's not going to have that by any means against Turner, who's a freak for this weight class. So Turner, extremely, extremely good play. The line is swollen out to minus 280 from when I called him at, I think, minus 241 earlier in the week, so that's not good. Still playable, though. I think probably playable out to 300 after that. It's, there's got to be better spots on this card. I think Petrino, now that Petrino's a cheaper price than Turner, Petrino's absolutely a better play against Prachnio than Turner is against Hooker. So if you feel like staying off this because you like Hooker and you just want to watch as a fan, go ahead. But I think this is a bit of a passing of the torch moment to Jalin Turner, particularly after he already put out one city kickboxing guy at the last International Fight Week. So give me Jalin Turner. Now we get on to my boldest call of the card. There's already many people are saying it. The Elves Brenner guy is calling another big dog. People have been complaining about the lines on this card, but if you do your homework, you can find value where, value's in the eye of the beholder. And in this fight between Robert Whittaker and Dricus du Plessis, I do see a lot of value on Mr. Still Knox, who I have bet in all three of his appearances since MMA RAX went live. He was one of my favorite fighters when I started really, really going into the weeds taping guys last year. When you start looking at the elite fighters in this sport, you see guys that move, they transcend beyond the realm of just merely being technically brilliant. The guys that ascend to become mixed martial artists, a goofy way of thinking about it is in Dragon Ball Z terms. Robert Whittaker is a fighter that I don't believe is going to ascend to Super Saiyan because he's perfectly content to outclass everyone with his fighting style that regularly generates decision wins over every high-level opponent that he has faced in the last 6 years, not named Israel Adesanya. Dricus du Plessis is a Super Saiyan because that guy will go into the fire and drag the people into the fire and defeat them every time. It's what he's done every time in the UFC. It's even what he did against Brad Tavares, even though we didn't get a result in that fight. Tavares got the first round on him, fell on top of him in a way that made everyone terrified of the grappling. But one thing a unique trend I have observed with du Plessis is that he is confident enough in his defensive wrestling and his ground defense and his ability to return to his feet that he will voluntarily allow guys to try to initiate their offensive game on the ground in a way that drains their gas tank. And most people are so distracted by the visual of du Plessis returning to his feet and being exacerbated and breathing through his mouth heavily, which the commentary team has noticed and referenced multiple times and have asked du Plessis about it. He said he had to get surgery to get his nose fixed. He opted not to do that before the Brunson fight, I believe, and has since done so. And he made a joke about it in the press run this week. I believe that he said he's now going to look less tired as opposed to being this mythical 15-minute cardio machine that some people backing him are expecting to see. But his style is interesting in that he enjoys not necessarily throwing guys into the fire with him, but getting guys to tire themselves out in trying to finish him, whether it's on the feet or on the ground, and then he reverses. And then when the fighters have already demonstrated and thought, oh, I'm going to be able to put this guy away, that is when du Plessis starts turning the tables, and the guys that thought they could lead on the striking exchanges or hit back and finish him start experiencing the counterpunching, which he does not get enough credit for. He is one of the most effective counterpunchers in the UFC. He is clean and he does damage with almost all of them. It is one of the main reasons he was able to turn the tables in the Brunson fight, and it is one of the main reasons he was able to turn the tables in the Tavares fight. Tavares had built himself into a fighter that wanted to keep things on the feet. He didn't necessarily want to go to the ground with du Plessis because he knew that was going to get him tired, and it did. Tavares wanted to lean on his jab and his striking, which is something Whittaker also wants to do. And if du Plessis is able to do what he has routinely done in these fights and get it into muddy waters, not necessarily deep waters, but muddy waters for both guys, as opposed to, the fire that we refer to that Charles Oliveira or Elves Brenner, went through. Perhaps that's a trend among shoot box fighters, but du Plessis, as opposed to going into the fire or the deep waters, he's a muddy waters guy. That is his style. He is the muddy waters. And against a guy that is so built on technical success like Whittaker is, those two things do not run together. And the guy that we have seen with a little bit more attrition, that is carrying more ring rust, is Whittaker. The last time Whittaker went in with at least a 10-month layoff to a fight, it was after his split decision with Yoel Romero. And he got knocked out in friendly confines by Israel Adesanya, and the moment was too big for him. Whittaker has so much respect for du Plessis in this spot, more than it seems the betting public or any of the MMA community want to be giving to du Plessis. But du Plessis, I think, has more of a style that is reflected in the fact that he is much more effective in getting finishes than any sort of style we have seen from Whittaker. Whittaker may have the technical brilliance, but he doesn't have the martial arts it factor that has helped him ascend to becoming a champion, or has helped him get these decisive finishing results that you want to see from these champions, that guys like Izzy, even when they become decision machines, are still capable of pulling out of themselves on occasions where they fight guys like Paulo Costa or in a rematch against Pereira. Everyone is thinking that Whittaker is going to outclass du Plessis, and that is really the only thing that I'm seeing here. I would expect that to be the case early on. But I also think if Whittaker is going to lean on his jab, that there's going to be plenty of opportunities for du Plessis to hit back with the counter punching. If Whittaker tries to mix it up, du Plessis welcomes that because it's part of the muddy waters style in terms of let's both get really exhausted and we'll see who has enough left to finish each other. This fight is going to get gross. A gross fight benefits a guy that is more used to thriving in that environment of gross martial arts than technical, clean fight that a guy with the size disadvantage, with a slight volume disadvantage, despite what some may say about the striking success. Whittaker's better defensively, no doubt, but offensively, we'll see how much more output one guy has over the other. But the reach, the stance switching, that's another thing about the muddy waters. You look at how exhausted du Plessis is, but his footwork it's so good when he's fresh, even when he's exhausted. The stance switching is constantly happening. He's bouncy on the foot. He's good at fighting off the back foot and the front. He's very, very well-rounded in a way I've seen few guys that enjoy betting on fights and capping fights have given him credit for. But I have seen cappers this week started to finally give him his due in terms of this guy at least doesn't have holes in his game. And when you're a muddy waters guy like du Plessis is, you feel good that your technique is going to be able to neutralize your opponent's strengths. He's fought more recently. I think he has more finishing upside, not only in terms of submissions, but also in terms of knockout. If this goes the distance, the promo edge has to go to a guy like du Plessis over someone like Whittaker, who we don't want to see fight Adesanya for a third time. When you have two guys in a feud over the continent of Africa that are ready to go to battle over the belt, that some people think they should already just be fighting for it anyway based on the feud. Whittaker could still 30-27 him. He could just be skirting the cage the whole time in a way where a bigger guy like du Plessis isn't able to catch up. And Whittaker, no doubt, has the UFC experience edge. He's earned the price tag he has. But it is a ridiculous price tag all the same, as is the one that Guram Kutateladze had last week when he had not fought for almost a year compared to Brenner, who had fought on a similar layoff compared to what du Plessis has. The muddy waters benefit Dricus, and I think this fight's going to get muddy. And I think du Plessis is the more confident fighter at this stage of his career where he is seeking to beat a guy that he has professed publicly he has beaten in grappling exchanges in Izzy. He's confident that he can beat Adesanya. If Whittaker wins this fight, Whittaker's been knocked out by this guy, has lost a decision to this guy that some people have thought that he won. But there's no way that Whittaker is going to be having the long-term confidence in terms of his career here that du Plessis has to be harboring. And it feels like Whittaker's become bored a little bit. He has a future doing the content here. If he wanted to become a UFC commentator, I would listen to that guy call fights right now over freaking Daniel Cormier. He's great to listen to. He's a fabulous interview. And he really is a class act. Great guy. But Dricus has the career momentum here, the finishing upside, and he's just more of an artist, I think, than Whittaker is at this stage in their careers. It was different earlier in the career when Whittaker was racking up more finishes, but as he's elevated into the higher level competition, the style is played out in a way where it's more conducive for him to point fight. And that's not going to go well against a guy like Dricus who says, look, I'm going to make this miserable for both of us. Has any fighter looked like they've had fun in a Dricus to Plessis fight? Show me the tape where any of them have enjoyed it. Nobody likes going into the muddy waters. They're dirty. They taste bad. They knock you over constantly. They hurt you. Imagine being in whitewater river rapids of shit. That is what Dricus du Plessis drags you into. That is what he will drag Robert Whittaker into, and that is how he will win this fight. Give me Dricus du Plessis at plus 300. And I will ride that with confidence into the co-main event of the evening, the flyweight title fight between Brandon Moreno and Alexander Pantoja. Now, a little fun fact as I'm recording this, there's a meeting of sharps happening in Las Vegas for International Fight Week. I don't know if it's happening as I'm recording this, but the winds are swirling. I've had a few different sharps, I keep in contact with, and one of them is the infamous. I shouldn't say infamous. He's a wonderful character on MMA Twitter. If I say infamous, it's only in jest, I promise. But the esteemed Marcus Williams of the Nubian Bookstore. I was talking to him about this fight as far back as last week, and he was very in on Pantoja, and I understood why. And in the interest of giving him a grade before he went out to Vegas and met with other guys I've been talking to, such as Adam Martin, he wanted to put one of his, famous, I'm speculating, but I would assume that he wanted to put a big bet in on Pantoja before he flew out west, which is why he was asking me what my confidence level was. So I graded the fight early for him, and what I came to the conclusion of was it was razor close. So if you are feeling confident in Pantoja, I don't think it's a bad bet. But I do slightly lean Moreno just because he's a little bit more proven at this point in their careers. Very close fight by the numbers. They have almost identical striking defense numbers, which is insane for flyweights. The takedown success and efficiency favors Moreno a little bit. They have identical takedown defense at 67%. Pantoja throws up submission attempts twice as often, which I think is something to monitor. I do think Pantoja has the finishing upside in this fight. But the longer the fight goes, even though Moreno has not had as much success going the distance in his MMA career, I think that was more of a problem earlier in his career. I know it didn't do him great in his rivalry with Figgy, but I still think that even though Pantoja has the finishing upside in this fight and is presumably going to have a little bit more striking success, at least early on, you've seen more from Moreno at a high level that makes you confident that he's going to do well. Pantoja running through Perez was phenomenal, but Perez was also coming off a lot of ring rust in that fight. Pantoja had been on quite a layoff himself, but it was evident which guy was more ready for the moment. And I think that's also reflected in the fact that Perez ended up having a cancellation in his following appearance. So I get the value, seeing the value on Pantoja. I think if you can play like an inside the distance decision, no action, that would be good. I saw somebody put out a really nice play that was, in fact, I'll shout them out for that because I think they actually followed me on Twitter. It was the Combat Guy. At the Combat Guy found a Pantoja round one only money line, any other result, no action. So that was if Moreno, it was at plus 130, which is so crazy. So the language is if Moreno wins, I think, like, no. Okay, hold on. Let me start over. Plus 130, round one only, money line, any other result, no action. The bet means there's a Pantoja finish in round one, it wins. If Pantoja gets finished by Moreno, it loses. If the bet goes past round one at all, it's just a push. So you get your money back if the fight doesn't end in the first 5 minutes. I think it's highly unlikely. If the fight ends in the first round, you have to think it's going to be Pantoja. So I think that's an awesome bet. So shout out to the Combat Guy, and thank you for the follow. I still have to go with Moreno here. People are making jokes that the cartel money's coming in late on him and it's ballooned him out to 215 range. I am still going to – I already put the pick out, so I've already revealed my hand that I'm siding with Moreno here, but I'm putting him in a moonshot. I don't like him at 2-1 odds. What I will say is I didn't realize that he was at Sanford when I was grading this. And one of the things that I thought was going to be a significant factor in this was Pantoja being at American Top Team compared to where Moreno had traditionally done his camps. Sanford was the MMA Gym of the Year last year. I think that's a very significant move for a guy that's holding the belt like Moreno to go to a camp like that to make that adjustment. And I think that that'll somewhat offset the exposure that Pantoja has at arguably the best gym in the world in American Top Team. So I think that Moreno's the side. I'm going to be picking him. I'm mostly going to be watching the fight as a fan just because it was really cool to see Izzy take down his career nemesis at 287. I'm honored I got to be in person for that. And it would be cool to see Moreno kind of do the same thing with Pantoja here, given the narrative that most people are familiar with that goes back to The Ultimate Fighter. So, vamos Moreno. And on to the main event. Alexander Volkanovski and Yair Rodriguez. We saw a bit of uncharacteristic bad fight IQ from Mr. Volkanovski in his fight with Makhachev. Now, I alluded to how a guy like Ribovics will voluntarily give up his back while he's in mount because he's confident that his commitment to Kimura setups is going to let him get back to the feet while they're having that moment of transition where he can fight the hands. The problem is when you fight a very high-level grappler, the moment you give up your back, they punish you for it, which is exactly how Makhachev was able to win 2 outright rounds against Volkanovski. So Volk giving up his back, electing to do that, that's not something you want to see. I hold that against every fighter that I see do it, so I don't play favorites. Sometimes it's a good decision to do it, but when you're a fighter and you become supremely confident in doing that, it can put you in a position sometimes where you end up getting, punished for electing to go that route. So I generally feel better about fighters that have demonstrated that they don't do that when they get put against the fence or when they're trying to get back to their feet. But the other thing we saw that was even more bizarre was Volkanovski talking to the corner of Makhachev, I believe, in the 4th round, and it led to Makhachev getting a takedown in on him that allowed Makhachev to control and win the round. In a fight where Volk, could have probably made the difference in a round where not much happened, Volk getting caught talking cost him dearly in what was the highest profile fight of his career. So I Jawing is never something I like to see. So that was just two things that concerned me about Volk. But, I mean, otherwise, the guy's the GOAT. I mean, what can you say? The stuff that he's been able to pull off is just simply phenomenal. And to go to 155 and fight a guy like Makhachev fearlessly and end the fight on top and winning the 5th round, hats off to that guy. He is, despite, the back giving, which he's confident he can, use to his advantage, and despite getting caught talking to Makhachev's corner during the round, the guy is a chess master. And that is what ultimately is going to be reflecting my thinking in this pick here, because even though I have Volk graded way, way above Yair, I recognize Yair is a very legitimate threat to win this fight. And I think that there's just more value on when you have two high-level violence technicians like this. We've seen it play out more often than not where the most elite of the elite end up canceling each other out in a way where we don't get a result and we have to turn it over to the judges. That is extremely key in this case, because not only does Volk, regularly bring things to a decision, and I think not only is he going to have the upside on the ground here, where some people have felt like he's going to be able to finish Yair on the ground if Yair fades late, but I mean, Yair's just going to be a threat to take Volk's head off. Just because of the size advantage and the Taekwondo acumen, he's going to be constantly looking at the top of Volkanovski's head like, if I just skim that the way that I did with Emmett, it's over for the guy. But the difference is Volk is just his footwork is amazing. So he's going to be able to mitigate with technique the strengths that Yair has on the feet. When the fight goes to the ground, Yair has developed his ground resistance game enough since losing to Frankie Edgar that, was it Frankie Edgar? Do I have that correct? Make sure I have that right. It was Frankie Edgar. Okay. All right. So he has shown enough improvement on the ground since then, I think, in terms of submission resistance, throwing up submissions to, aid to getting back to his feet. Also throwing elbows from the back. I know people were very jazzed on when he did that in, I believe, the Holloway fight. I didn't take too much out of the Ortega result. I think, watching how he competed against Emmett, you really saw a guy who even claimed himself was just kind of naturally running on instinct. He said he got hit by Emmett so hard in the last fight that he doesn't even remember actually winning the title. He just remembers just kind of going and throwing. And that reckless abandon is beautiful to watch, but it's something that a guy like Volkanovski, who knows how to turn this into violent chess, is going to be able to neutralize. At the same time, I think Yair's going to be able to provide enough resistance with what I just mentioned to get it back on the feet. That kind of mutual resistance, I think, is going to play out in a way where we don't see a whole lot of violence unleashed that has finishing capability as much as plays out in an aesthetic fashion. To that point, the over 4.5 rounds on this was at minus 125 when I dialed this pick in earlier this week. It has since gone to plus odds. And I think that's mostly because Volkanovski made interview rounds yesterday and had a cut on his face from sparring, but it was a cut on his cheek. Show me a fight where the result has been ended by, a cut getting opened up on a cheek. Not only that, I mean, did you see the last Holloway Volkanovski fight? I mean, come on, folks. I'm not worried about any damage Volk has from sparring on his face. I would venture that cut's probably going to get opened up again if Yair's able to glance him with a kick on the cheek. But my guess is this fight goes the distance. If it does go the distance, I mean, I do think Volk is going to win by decision based on my grades. But if this fight is close, the promo push for Mexico for the UFC right now is undeniable. And City Kickboxing is in hot water with the Nevada Commission after the Kai Kara France Albazi blowback. They were very vocal about shitting on the judges. They were not kind about it. And the commission is petty as hell. If you've watched this sport long enough, you know they are petty as hell. So if this fight is close, I could see them taking the belt away from Volk almost just out of spite. And Volk could invoke a rematch, but he could also go rematch Makhachev and probably get more money from the UFC for doing that than if he were to rematch Yair right away at featherweight versus moving up to lightweight permanently and not having as brutal of a weight cut. Could they force him into that situation where that becomes the best move for him? If the result is ambiguous, I'm going to be worried about that. So I'm hedging with the rounds, going plus 4.5, especially at plus money. It's basically been a pick 'em all week. And I'm going to hope to enjoy this as much as a fan as much as I can, assuming it goes the distance. But, I mean, hey, we've all seen that reverse elbow that Yair put in on Korean Zombie. The guy can end the fight at any second. But if you include that result, let's say that fight went to decision, that would be, because it was the final second of the fight that it ended, but that would be 16 out of 26 UFC appearances for these guys where the fight has gone the distance. So I feel pretty good given all of the previous results that they've had against the sum of their UFC careers, that they're probably going to be treating this like chess. Yair's going to want to take his head off, but the longer the fight goes, I think the more unlikely it is for him to be able to unleash a full-fledged kick that's able to do that. The longer the fight goes, the more Volk is going to be able to be creative in setting up opportunities to get inside and get on the ground. And I think Volk has to... I can't imagine the guy doesn't think that's his best path to winning, even though he's demonstrated he can avoid the ground entirely against guys like even Holloway and just make the striking experience miserable enough for them and still dominate the fight. But Yair offers a level of kicking that is dangerous to a guy with the size disadvantage that Volk has here, where you have to hope that he's going to be mixing it up a little bit more than what he did in his last fight against Max. So give me the plus 4.5. It's now plus 100. And we'll figure out what the last leg is going to be on this parlay, but Vitor Petrino and the Niko Price Lawler minus 2.5. Those are both, I'm feeling very good about those already. You know, once we get that third leg, we're going to slap some Duplessis 300 on there. We'll probably put the Yair Volk plus 4.5 also out as a 4-leg. And also, if that Tyra Kairez 1.5 stays at plus 105, we can run that as a parlay as well. So, going to be some fun options for the the longer stuff this week outside of the 3 or 4 leg. We'll see what I end up doing for the 3 or 4 unit one just to break even or come out a little bit ahead depending on what happens. But All in due time. Check back after the weigh-ins tomorrow, and happy International Fight Week to all. Hope you enjoyed that little fireworks show I gave you to celebrate my success. But yeah, it was a good 4th of July over here, and happy Fight Week, everyone. We'll be back next week for a card that many are already dreading. They're calling it the worst fight night since Strickland Magomedov. Just kidding. But it is another Apex one. It's Holly Holm and Mayra Bueno Silva. The co-main event is Jun Young Park and Albert Duraev. So you know I'm going to be all over that one. But yeah, we've got how many picks this week now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 picks this week on a 12-bet winning streak. The potential to get to 20 is there. 21 even. We'll see if it happens. But until the results are final, I want to thank you very much for tuning into the MMA RAXPOD, and I meant everything I said in that opening rant. And I will be back next week for UFC Fight Night Holm Silva. Until then, happy International Fight Week to all, and hope you enjoyed your 4th of July, and good luck on your bets. Take care, folks.